Afternoon Talk on SAFM.
Okay, just so you know it, so I sort of went to bed at 1:30 and woke up at about finally at 6 o'clock, ish or thereabouts, in between all of that, watching that US election. Why are we interested? Because, like it or not, it does have an impact on us, doesn't it? So there we are. Barack Obama, once again, the president for another 4 years. That's not what we're going to be talking about. We're going to talk about something that's particularly important, I think, to us, and that's the issue of corporate social investment, or CSI. And I'm wondering who really wins in CSI. Is it win-win, or perhaps should it be win-win-win? We'll find out. I want to get your thoughts on it. You can, in fact, call in right away, 0891 104207. My name's Ashraf Garda. You can also SMS us to 34701 at a cost of £2. Tweet to me, Ashraf Garda1, and also comment on my Facebook page. And then, being a Wednesday, we look at 3 or 4 issues around entrepreneurship in the Moneymakers feature, including the SAB Foundation's second annual Social Innovations Award. And hopefully you'll listen to that and find it pretty inspiring indeed. And talking about inspiration, what about Mabuyane Kekana? Well, she's the editor of the Motor Mania newspaper supplement, the first female editor, I believe, of a supplement of that sort in the country. Well, we're going to put her in the spotlight. Lots to ask her about women and their work in the media, but also driving fancy cars. We'll see about that. All that coming up later. Let's start then with the big issue for now, corporate social investment. Who really wins? Is it in fact a win-win or win-win-win situation? John Young, we're going to start with, we're going to get to Zane Dengo in a second. Let's start with John Young, who's a senior writer of South African Business, Western Cape Business, Gauteng Companies, and host of other provincial print titles. John, good afternoon. Hi.
Hello, Ashraf. How are you?
Indeed. I'm very well, thank you. Let's talk about this. How would you answer that if I asked you who's really winning in corporate social investment projects?
Well, I think the country's winning in the end, because it's quite interesting to me that the name has changed to corporate social investment. And sometimes when you hear name changes like that, it's really just a branding exercise, and it doesn't mean a great deal. But I think the word investment does imply that companies are taking it a lot more seriously, that they truly are saying to themselves, we need to build our country.
Mm-hmm. And you're pretty sure that it's ultimately it's what, government or the country that's winning?
I think the citizens are winning. I mean, I've been fortunate enough to be with Transnet Rail Engineering in the last couple of weeks. I went to Uitenhage and I went to their Salt River Works, and the investment they're putting into education, both with their corporate social investment program, but also in internal programs with their School of Engineering, their artisans, is creating people who are doing the work. And the Transnet Rail Engineering workshop in Uitenhage is churning out fantastic wagons, which are being done by these people who are properly trained. And that has to be the way forward. We have to get skilled people doing work.
Okay, we're going to find out more about corporate social investment. Just an opening line then from Zane Dengo, who's the special advisor to the Minister of Social Development. Zane, good afternoon. Hi.
Good afternoon, Ashraf.
Thank you. How would you answer that? I mean, who's really winning? Or more importantly, is it win-win between, government on the one hand, and you're very much a part of that, between the companies, and then ultimately between the public? So I'm almost saying 3 different angles to that triangle.
Yeah, look, I didn't hear, I was just connected quite late, so I didn't hear the earlier part of the question, but I think, what we must make it, we must distinguish between good corporate citizenship and corporate social investment. Within that kind of scenario, you'll find win-win situations, and I think often we don't make that distinction. For example,
well, what is the difference according to you?
Well, I think if you talk about good corporate citizenship, you will then make companies, in terms of their license to operate, ensure that they employ people, keep them in employment, pay decent wages. In countries like South Africa, pay taxation, ensure health and safety issues. So the kind of the wellness of the people that work for them in the communities in which they work, or where they pull their labor from. I think that's the issue of good corporate citizenship. And often you find that, and this is not necessarily the case with many of the companies in South Africa, but you often find the case where some companies would be investing in corporate social investment to HIV and AIDS projects and other such projects, but in fact, their own corporate citizenship issues in terms of how they treat.
Okay, that's a fascinating point you bring up. John Young, you want to comment to that? Or on that one, where in fact companies invest or they fund or sponsor projects that ultimately benefits community, but people who work for them, in fact, are shortchanged.
Well, I don't have evidence of that. I mean, I don't know how that would play out. I just see the vital aspect of investing in a community to grow the people. I mean, ultimately, if one is cynical, they're growing a market, they're growing people who can buy their goods. But if the spin-off, if the spin-off is the people are healthier and wealthier, that has to be a good thing.
Okay, I want to also invite callers 0891104207. I see some people also commenting on my Facebook page, so certainly do that anyway. Zain, let's just go back in terms of your understanding then. So, corporate social investment, John spoke earlier about, maybe various name changes over the years. Your simple understanding of it is what?
Look, for me, it's a question of, corporate social investment is essentially a change in the way companies engage in philanthropy, and I think it's a change for the better. I think the move away from the kind of checkbook philanthropy in the past, where people would put the X amount of a percentage of their budget to give to good causes, and as part of reputation management or brand management. I think what you're finding now is a move towards investing in critical areas that is seen as in need of support. For example, where there's a gap from both from the state sector. So education, the kind of investment we're seeing going into education is quite significant and necessary, and in many, many ways complements what government is doing. I mean, recently and I don't know if I can mention companies' names.
No, please do.
We had a very good presentation given to us by Tiger Brands, and what they were doing is having breakfast at school and sponsoring breakfast at school, which and the way it was done actually complemented the school nutrition program in many of the poorer schools that and actually showed government what needs to be done to have proper nutritional programs in schools. So those kind of models where there's a real investment in communities and people, that makes a difference. And it's not a question of just, reputation management, brand management, sponsorship. And it's vastly different. I think in the past, the kind of distinctions between sponsorship, brand management, reputation management, and actually companies investing as part of being good corporate citizens. And that for me is more important. This notion of being good corporate citizens and actually earning the right to operate in particular areas.
John Young, your thoughts on, do you find that companies are in fact under pressure to corporate social invest?
Well, I think Zain makes a very good point about getting away from the idea of charity. I mean, Michael Spicer has spoken about aligning CSI with your core business. Volkswagen talk about strategic giving. I think that's quite important. And of course, government has insisted that if companies want to have a proper BEE score sheet, then they should donate, or they should spend, shall I rather say, 1% of net profit after tax on social economic development. And they need to spend 3% on enterprise development. So, I mean, these are imperatives that have come down from the national government, and basically companies are obliged to spend. And increasingly they're spending on things like education and enterprise development rather than housing, which is being seen as more of a government responsibility. I mean, education currently makes up 36.8% of the corporate social investment in South Africa. So 36.8% is a large chunk, and a company like Volkswagen invests in education in lots of different ways, at pre-primary all the way through to research chairs at the University of Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University. So and obviously with artisan training in between. So, as I say, Volkswagen call it strategic giving.
Okay, strategic giving, does it in fact work? In inviting callers, Alec, I'll come to you in just a second, but certainly you can think about it in terms of your understanding as a listener, as a South African, around the issues of corporate social investment. So questions you may want to ask on that issue that you're uncertain about, but also maybe your thoughts in terms of companies where they've absolutely worked. So a company has invested, and therefore corporate social investment, and the benefit has been there for the company. It's certainly been there for the community or the areas where they've invested, and it certainly has therefore assisted government as well in terms of its own objectives, in terms of social development as well. So I'll get your calls. Let's start with Alec in Joburg. Hi. Hi, Alec.
Good afternoon, Ashraf.
Hi, how's it, man?
Good, man.
Good.
Always excellent program.
Thank you.
And excellently put questions, I dare say, that get this thing going, and me in particular.
Good.
But I'd like your guests perhaps to look at this whole thing from a different angle, because while corporate social investment comes across in this whole thing as a sort of a noble idea, even if one excludes the charitable stroke legislative charitable nature and origins thereof, the fact that this notion of corporate social investment has come about is reflective or manifest of another situation, and perhaps of which it is the cause, and that is deprivation on a broad level, because I think that's what the social investment is actually aimed towards, is redressing some or other inequitous position that corporates have attained, because it is a fact that any corporate will invest in any aspect that will advance its interests, both positive and negative interests, negative in the sense of any kind of social sanction and or legal sanction that might exist. So I'd like your guests to approach the subject on that matter, because if we weren't faced with, and it's a worldwide problem, not just necessarily in South Africa, where it might just be a bit more extreme, does the solution really lie in corporate social investment, or does it actually involve perhaps a more equitous distribution of the value that is generated by these organizations in the form of wages? Marikana springs to mind.
All right, let's get a response, Alec. Let's get a response. Thanks for raising that. Indeed, that is Alec in Joburg. Further calls and opinions and comments and anecdotal evidence as well in the way you see it. All of that welcome. Did I say you can SMS? Of course you can. 34701. That's going to cost you 2 rands. I've got two guests. John Young, who's a senior writer of South African Business, that's the title, Western Cape Business, Gauteng Companies, and many other provincial print titles. Zain Dango is a special advisor to the Minister of Social Development, so very much in that department. Zain, maybe let's just start with you to respond to Alec's concerns. Okay, we seem to have lost that call. Zain, are you still there? Okay, we've lost. Let's see if we can get to Zain back. If we've lost some of the other callers, please do call back. John, maybe let's just get to you while we hook up with Zain once again. Just your thoughts on Alec's concerns?
Well, I think he's raising questions that go far beyond the scope of this discussion. I mean, do we need socialism in South Africa, I think is what he's asking. And I don't think that can be answered when we're discussing private companies and talking about their own social investment. I mean, I think it's a legitimate question, but I think it goes beyond the scope of what we're talking about.
All right. What then? I mean, your thoughts then in terms of the delicate balance between government and government's agenda and government's needs, and utilizing, in fact, my understanding, allowing companies to invest in projects that government can't fulfill themselves, and therefore incentivizing them for that. I mean, just give us an insight into how the delicate balance works.
Well, I think what is interesting is the growing investment by the private sector in enterprise development. I mean, most of Pick n Pay's 175 million in 2011 was spent on enterprise development, and that is quite clever because it grows your supply chain. I mean, Woolworths Foundation have just given a loan of R1 million odd to some Limpopo farmers, and the idea is that they're going to give them sell them 400 tons of tomatoes and 200 tons of tomatoes to the markets. And the idea is that a commercial farmer is going to mentor them, and the mentoring farmer doesn't get paid anything unless his mentees, if there's such a word, the emerging farmers actually make some profit. So here we have something concrete that supports the company, whether it's Walmart or Pick n Pay or South African breweries getting hops from their emerging farmers in the Midlands of KwaZulu-Natal. And Zimele is the Anglo-American fund that supports small businesses down the supply chain in the mining sector. And that is very much a growing way of investing in communities. In other words, growing small businesses and ensuring that they will have someone to sell their product to.
All right, Zane Dango is back with us. Zane, you want to respond to the comments raised by Alec when we lost you earlier on?
Look, sure. Sorry, I don't know what parts I missed when I was cut off. I just want to respond to the question I think one of the callers raised about, is corporate social investment the strategy, or should we be looking at the issues of inequities? And I think for me that is the fundamental question that we should be addressing, because and I think when I spoke about this notion of corporate social citizenship or good corporate citizenship, this is exactly the point that I'm trying to make. Is what is more important than actually giving money to charities or even the strategic investments, even though these are innovative and useful. But the first port of call is to ensure that companies actually are aware of their social and economic impact. So, for example, and I think the question of Marikana came up here.
Yes.
If you're working in a particular community and you actually, your business, your license to operate is based on the extracting certain value from that community, your investment in that immediate community should be significant and visible. And the social impact thereof is actually more important. And I think those are the kind of issues that we need to be discussing, is to what extent are you beginning to invest in a more fundamental way?
Okay. Well, maybe you can, maybe you can give us some examples. I mean, considering you are from social development, to what extent is that happening where companies will invest in the areas around where they reside specifically, and then broader? So it effectively changes and enhances that community completely. Because I say that in the light of the fact that, as you know, there's still criticism about many big companies from many people, whether they have their own agendas or not, I don't know, but suggesting that they essentially milk those communities.
Look, there's good and bad examples. I think if one looks at the kind of good examples, you look at some of the older, more established mining companies like Anglo, in terms of their wellness initiatives, the HIV/AIDS programs, the kind of investment they make in staff in the communities that they had operated in some of these mines. Those are very useful. I think in the platinum belt, we're not seeing the same kind of investments. And I think those are the kind of issues that we need to ascertain. A very crude example, and this is about 10 years ago. We had a big brand like Nike. So Nike would be giving to children's charities, but at the same children's charities in the U.S. and South Africa and other places. But at the same time, there were critiques that Nike was actually their products was being produced by child labor in India. So those kind of issues, we must make the distinction between how you actually your product, your investment, the way you actually develop your value, and where you actually invest money afterwards. And often what we find is that many companies would not be too aware about their social impact, but would be willing to give money to charities, which for me is where the distinction between crude sort of brand management or investing in corporate social investment for reasons
in.
Other than making a social impact.
Yeah, but I mean, John Young, if I can bring you in, yes, comment?
Could I just ask Zane something? Discuss something with him.
Yeah.
I mean, I absolutely agree with him that companies have that responsibility to their own employees and to their community. But does he accept that there's also a line at which the company's responsibility does end, and local government must kick in?
Well, I think that would be pretty obvious, isn't it? Zane, respond to that?
Yes, but I'm not sure in Marikana whether that has been very clear.
Yeah.
I think that we must also accept that corporate social investment can never, ever replace good governance and investment by government. That there is a line where, where the kind of investments by corporate social, by using corporate funds to do what government should have done, is actually not the answer. You're actually taking away the responsibility of government, and particularly local government, to invest in critical areas, water, housing, and we should be ensuring that the state where it has the mandate to do that, does that to the best of its abilities and not expect the corporate sector to do that. At the same time, we must also ensure that where the corporate sector is engaged in particular communities, that they invest to the extent that they should be investing to build up those communities.
Now, there's an SMS from a Facebook comment from Athanasius saying, and I'm sort of just reading a shortened version. The truth is there is people do it to avoid tax, cheap marketing and promotion, and the signs of falling NGOs' lack of genuine social responsibility projects are there. You can't generalize social responsibility. And then Athanasius continues, but says which large corporate is involved in rehabilitation? Not too sure if that is it. I mean, maybe Zane, you get this one first. I mean, is it so often slanted that we need to do this for the PR, and that's a point that you argued against. But what I'm saying, in practical terms, is it still ultimately done on that basis, although it's couched in very much making a responsible commitment lesson?
Look, I think it's mixed. I can't say that there's any one approach to corporate social investment. I think I've been involved in this for a number of years, and I've seen the corporate sector in South Africa really making an attempt to move towards a conception of good corporate citizenship, where they invest not only for the sake of brand management, but actually invest because they have a vested interest in developing the countries and communities. But there's also large sections of the community, or the corporate sector, that actually still engaged in more the kind of sponsorship issues, the brand management issues, not the strategic corporate social investment issues that John is talking about.
Okay.
But so what is missing? I think what is missing is a collective approach by the corporate sector on how to spend this. And I think that when we try and talk about these issues, there's always this refrain that says the corporate sector would never want to become part of a collective to deal with these issues. But there was precedent in the past. You did have the corporate sector coming together through the South African Grantmakers Association, for example. These kind of initiatives don't exist anymore, but I think it's about time that we resuscitate them.
Okay, now I want to get to two of the quick callers very quickly before we get to news. But somebody says government is not giving any feedback in any way to those who do CSI. So why should companies do it now? John, maybe you can answer this one, not so much directly, but is there a CSI scoreboard that if we want to understand who's doing it well, we can see that at a glance?
Well, there's a publishing company called Trialogue who bring out a annual CSI handbook, and that's very reliable, and most people go by that. According to Trialogue, just to talk back to Athanasia, South African companies in 2010-11 financial year spent 6.2 billion on community social investment. Now, that's quite a sizable input, and I understand her cynicism about some of the programs, and she's absolutely right. When it's done for T-shirts and photographs, it's rubbish. But when Standard Bank spends 12 million rand in the Northern Cape on schools, and they've actually built them, and they're there, they've got a roof, it really does count for something.
That's beyond PR. Okay, let's get two quick calls because we're almost on to news. We need to wrap up. Confidence, just quick call, 30 seconds, please, to make your point. Hi, Confidence.
Yeah, I've had a discussion around corporate social investment and
make your point. You got 30 seconds, please.
Yeah, it should not only be the issue of investing in any specific project, but it should also be the issue of business conduct that we have to look at. It might be fashionable to talk about Marikana, but if we forget, for example, the hostels that we are having on the eastern side of Johannesburg, and the conditions in which those people are doing, and the fact that their conditions are contributed to by business, then we are making a mockery of whatever that we say we believe in.
Okay, got that. Confidence. Thanks for that one. Kevin, I'm going to ask you again, 30 seconds to make your point. Hi.
Okay, in terms of brand management, brand recognition, when they give money, they need to make sure that the money is funded properly, rather than saying, yes, 10,000 rand, yes, it's for a certain function. They need to make sure that the people at the bottom use it wisely, for example, programs, various functions as well. And secondly as well, giving them money, you got to make sure you get the reward. Teach them how to fish rather than giving them the fish. That's from a CSI point of view. That's what actually happens. We're giving them the money, but we can't be giving them all the time. We need to teach them how to use it.
Kevin, I'm going to move on. Kevin, thanks for that one. Point well made. Right, let's just wrap up again. 30 seconds for both of you in final, in conclusion. That is, Dango, just your thoughts. I mean, what's the one thing that needs to be asked around CSI that hasn't been addressed?
Look, I think the point that's been made about the work that Trialogue does is valid. I think that Trialogue work gives us a sense of how much is being spent. I think our challenge is to ensure that this money is actually spent where it's most needed. The 6 billion is significant, but if we can concentrate that 6 billion in the areas, the poorest parts of South Africa, and actually engage with schools, NGOs and CBOs operating the poorest communities in South Africa, where there's state failure and there's market failure, then we're going to begin to make a difference. At the moment, that 6 billion is dispersed in areas where it does not necessarily make the biggest difference.
Okay, that's
we're engaging with dialogue and the corporate
all right,
sector.
interesting point. John Young, 30 seconds to conclude.
Well, I think it's correct that companies are spending most of their money on education, and I think it's correct that the movement in spending patterns is towards enterprise development. Because if people can, as the caller said, fish, then they can eat.
Okay, that's where we can leave it. John Young, a senior writer for South African Business, Western Cape Business, Gauteng Companies, also done lots of work extensively on the issue around CSI, and before that, Zane Dengo, special advisor to the Minister of Social Development, that's Batabile Dlamini. You can continue talking about this. You can email me, ashraf@safm.co.za. And by the way, any suggestions you have for the big question in terms of topics, well, they're always welcome. We're going to talk money makers in a moment. Let's get the news headlines first.